Hey guys, my name is Amy. I am an optimizer here at Fine Skills. We specialize in optimization, so clients that are already in Filevine, but I also work with our CGIS clients. I have CGIS certification, so that's usually government entities. But we'll go ahead and get started with task flow and deadline chains. We'll start with the task flow portion. So I will share my screen here. I'm going to walk through some of the basics initially. All right, so tasks. There are two ways to trigger automatic tasks. And the first way is through a phase change. So as soon as a project enters in a phase, you can even have tasks trigger if it enters in that leading phase, like intake. So you can have some tasks trigger as soon as that project's created. And maybe that's for someone to assign that team or make sure, all that is set up appropriately when at the creation. You can do it that way. Also, it can be triggered in an action button. And action buttons are best kind of used when it's a task flow that's not necessarily phase based. So for example, if medical records is a really popular one, your medical records collection, because unfortunately, especially in personal injury, we're collecting medical records throughout the life of a case. You're on discovery and find out about a doctor that the client didn't tell you about, and you're like, oh no. But you can add that action button in meds, and we'll walk through what they look like. Tips and tricks and best practices for task flows. And of course, completion of another task can trigger a task. So let's pop in to the back end here and kind of how you can set up task flows. So, right. All right, so yes, you would choose that auto trigger, kind of like what we were just talking about. We'll start with phases. There's a couple of neat things that you see here that I've done. I've done a little formatting codes. Filevine has some formatting codes, so you can actually draw attention by whether you're bolding your font, making it purple here. Click on it here, and then you can also apply links. I really like using links if a staff member needs part of their task is to go into a certain section to generate a document, complete something. I like to plug in that link here into the task. And here, when you're creating that task, here is where you can create the auto task when the phase changes, or if it's at the completion of another task. You can also have, the task flow also doesn't have to be completely linear. You can have like a tree, you can have 3 tasks triggering at the same time, whatever you want to do. I have some clients that want to trigger all the tasks for that particular phase all at one time because there's not a specific order. They need to be completed. You'll notice that when you click when the phase change, you'll see a checkbox for repeat task. This repeating task is helpful. Most likely, I see it for client communication. So if you have like a cadence where you want to make sure your clients are being contacted, this repeat task is perfect for that. That's what a lot of my clients use it for. There's a couple of ways to set that up, especially if it's for client communication. One good example of how to set that up is go ahead and have it create early, because you never know if that client is going to call in between your 30-day cadence, for example. So have it create immediately as soon as that phase changes to be due in whatever amount of time that you'd like. Maybe it's 30, 60, make it due and then 30. And then have it repeat the next day to be doing another 30. It took me a while when I was building out task flows as a paralegal before I worked at Filevine and worked here to figure out that that's the best way. You don't want to make it repeat every 30 days to be doing 30, or then it's going to actually be a 60-day cadence. You can also set up the task to repeat only in the selected phase. So if you want to set up a different cadence for each phase, maybe you don't want to contact that client. You want to set the cadence differently in litigation since it moves a little bit slower than pre-litigation, then I would make this selection. If you do not check this box, it will repeat the whole life of the case until it is archived. We also have your you have time tracking details. If you do any time and billing for time and billing clients, this is where you can make a suggestion for the amount of time, the task code, activity code, the suggested hours, if it's billable or chargeable. In this will, as soon as the task is complete, this will prompt the user to enter in this information and make sure that they get those suggested hours entered into time and billing. Your assigned role, as everybody knows, these tasks are role-based. So you do have to select the role that the task is assigned to. You can do and also notify. So for example, if your medical records clerk is getting medical records notification, for medical record collections, he or she needs to get those tasks, then you can also have the paralegal be also notified, like, hey, heads up, this is where your clerk is at in the medical records process. When you select when an auto task is completed, you'll notice there's a little bit of a change. Repeating tasks can only be triggered by a phase change. So keep that in mind. If you're wanting a repeating task, you're wanting to build that workflow, repeating tasks cannot be triggered by the completion of another task. Also, something to keep in mind when you're building out your task flow, especially when you're doing the ones that are triggered by the completion of another task. This box right here, you are going to want to make sure that you're selecting it if this is a task that no longer needs to happen if it goes into another phase. If it needs to happen regardless, make sure you do not select that box. By default, it doesn't select. So that's usually the use case. Most people still want all the tasks completed in that phase, regardless of the phase change. All right. And that is the tasks that are triggered in a phase change. So building out the task is going to be pretty similar. In action buttons, it's just the trigger that is different. So when you go over to your action buttons, you can put them anywhere in any place in your template, any section. They're great in collection sections, action buttons. They're also great for case-specific task flows. For example, if you have a specific task flow for any cases with minors, action buttons are great for that as well. The creating of an auto task is the same as you would for phase tasks. You're going to have the same options here for the trigger when another auto task completed or when the button itself has been pressed. Same, all these other options over here. One thing I want to bring your attention to for repeating tasks, if you do a repeating task in a action button, that task will repeat until that action button has been reset. And as far as permissions go in Filevine, only project admins can reset an action button. So keep that in mind if you set any repeating tasks. Some of my clients want to do that for medical records follow-up. And I kind of walk them through that process. And not all users realize that they have to reset the button to get it to stop, or they don't have the permissions to do so. So just keep that in mind if you're thinking about utilizing repeating tasks in an action button. Now let's talk about how you reset that action button. Now that we've talked about it, let's go ahead and trigger one here on our front end. Like the one I've got built out is in our medical records. You'll see this one right here has already been activated, and you'll see a little orange reset. So this reset button is actually not going to pop up, or you won't be able to pop up for a user that is not a project admin. So just a collaborator. So keep that in mind for anybody that needs to reset. To reset, you just click reset task flow, and there you go. And then you have the ability to retrigger the task flow for any particular reason. Maybe your user needs to come in here and request different dates of service for medical records, anything like that. So you can come in and then start that task flow again. And then, as we know, it pops up in our activity feed. Another great thing that we always suggest to utilize in tasks are going to be tags. So in our tags here that you apply, if you apply, kind of get your list of tags that you're using, make sure they're in Tag Manager, and you apply them to your task flow. This allows for better organization of your tasks. They're easier to view especially medical requests or tasks related to intake or negotiations. If you have any tasks related to negotiations, you can click on the tag and it'll organize all of your tasks. It's also way easier for reporting. So some of my clients have tasks that are very specific to statute of limitations, the review process, to make sure it's entered in properly, and then an attorney review. You can have a tag for SOL, and then you can run reports on all of those to make sure there's not any that are like high priority tasks that are overdue or not being completed. Like I said, how to add those to your tasks, you just make sure they're in Tag Manager, and then you just do hashtag and what that tag is. It will trigger that tag here when you trigger the task, and then you can click on the tag and it'll filter, just automatic filter. Again, it's great for reporting purposes. For the task flow, your users will also be able to organize their tasks by that tag here as well. Pop back in our front end here. Another kind of tips and tricks as far as task flow goes. I always like to kind of walk through my clients, their process, and what makes sense for a task flow and what makes sense to maybe utilize what's called a multi-select list. If you have a workflow where the the staff member needs to collect certain items, for example, file setup area, intake, that's a really popular space to include what's called a multi-select field. And I will show you exactly what that looks like. Pop into my little sample intake here. We actually have a multi-select right here. It kind of looks like a checklist, if you will. So when you're using a multi-select, you can actually build out a little checklist. This prevents you from having to create a task for every single one of these items that can get a little cumbersome for your staff. Just in doing some of the Filevine audits, I found that some of my clients where they have really heavy task flow process, that their staff is getting they're getting overwhelmed and they're not necessarily completing their tasks. Like they're doing it, but then they're not going in and completing them because there's so many. So this can help a little bit where they can just go through like, okay, I've got the retainer signed, the HIPAA signed, police report, and check. You can even add a text field here, a large text field where they can put in notes here next to it for whatever reason. Maybe there isn't a police report, so you can put a note field here and say like no police report. These fields are still reportable, so you can still report on and see what's not done yet. You can pull in that note field for any notes. You'll also see, let me open up my front end view over here again. You'll also see here when I'm referencing that checklist, I put a link to it right here as well. So this helps kind of guide the staff member to the workflow to make sure that they know where that checklist is, what section it's in, and can fill it out. And then they can, add a little note here as to, oh, hey, we're waiting on that police report, kind of like what I did here in the thread. so that know that that task flow is being worked on. And this is, we found it to be pretty successful for, like I said, for really heavy task flows. I've even had built out for some clients where they actually create a checklist per phase, just because they have a super heavy just task flow as part of their process. So we've even built out like it would be a section that says phase checklist, and it has a ton of just checklists per phase that pops up. And then you can put a completion, date field completion. So that's just kind of something fun you can actually do by incorporating your fields that you have in your template builds, and also the great things that you can do with tasks. So, all right, that is, and that's really our task flow here. Now we can kind of dive into deadline chains. And again, feel free to use our Q&A feature if you have any questions. All right. Deadline chains. So deadline chains, they're going to be a little different than task flows since they are date triggered and they are going to have hard deadlines. The best use case I usually see for deadline chains are for something, an area where you have a really strict where you have kind of a formulated case management order. So if you have a judge that as soon as you get that trial date, has like a formulated case management order that you guys use, then the deadline chain works really well for that. I've also seen deadline chains used for keeping up with service statutes, discovery. You can trigger it as soon as you receive discovery or as soon as you send out discovery. Either way, just to make sure that the discovery is, there's no motion to compel floating around, or you need to file a motion to compel as soon as you can. That's, again, another great use case for deadline chains. So let's look at building. Looks like I've got a trial deadline chain here that we built out in our training. So the first thing you do in a deadline chain is you want to have your anchor date or parent date. That's going to be your first manually entered date that triggers everything else. I've seen it, and it can be either the trial date that's way further on down the road, or it can be a file date. So maybe you file a complaint and then some things need to happen after that. You can even have both. So you don't necessarily need to have only one manually entered anchor or parent date. Maybe there's a few that triggers a bunch of different things, and you can put it in one deadline chain. If you're new to deadline chains, I wouldn't suggest starting out with something super complicated like that to build it, because it can get confusing if you're not as familiar with deadline chains. But just know that it does have that capability. So here we've just got an example of a trial deadline chain. Again, we built it out in training. You have options where you can select when you're building out the deadline chain, where you can select the jurisdiction, and you can even plug in a URL that you're referencing. So if you have local rules, you can plug in here for your deadline chain, and anything in that jurisdiction again, so you know, okay, I know this is for this particular jurisdiction. Like I said, you start with add a deadline, and let's add us a deadline here. So this is where you enter in the name of the deadline. This is going to be what you see on your calendar when it's triggered, on the project calendar, and all users that are subscribed. You have the option to select the independent on another deadline. If it is your anchor or parent deadline, then you do not want to select that. This is a deadline that you are manually entering in. You also have the option to hide in calendars. If you have, if it's going to be a deadline that is one that you're manually entering in, maybe you select that. I have some clients where they don't want them particular deadlines on their calendars because it's just excessive. It's just like a reminder that they have some deadlines that are in there as part of their process. Just, hey, you need to do this, but X amount of days before maybe it's a deposition. You need to get a deposition binder ready 2 weeks before the deposition, and it's just part of a deadline chain. Then maybe you want to hide that from calendar so it's not popping up on the attorney's calendar. It's going to default as not checking either of these boxes, so keep that in mind. Reminder schedule. You can come in here and select your reminder schedule. We've got several in here because it's our sandbox from our training. Most of you guys will have the Filevine default reminder schedule, which is can be pretty aggressive. So let's talk about reminder schedules for just a minute, since they do pretty heavily affect deadline chains. So reminder schedule will be right here in your advanced menu. And I'm going to open it up in a new tab so we don't lose our space. You can create as many of these as you want. It's always suggested for us, by us, that you kind of plug in the cadence. So this one, for example, 120 days before, 80, 10, 3. If you put that in the naming convention of the reminders, then you know exactly what you're selecting. I have some of my clients that will call it like an SOL reminder schedule because that's the one they want to use for SOLs, or trial reminders. That's the specific reminders they want to use for trial dates. You can totally do that. But you can create as many of these as you want. To add a new date, you type it in here and then you click plus. So let's say 160 days, I click my little plus and it adds it in right here. To remove these reminders, you just click the little X and it will remove it from your schedule. You can delete them by clicking the little trash can. You can star it. And it will make it default. You can only have one org default. Org default will be what it defaults to in your deadline reminder schedules, in your deadline fields, your deadline chains, and it will be the schedule for your reminder section. So those non-customizable, just reminder section that you have in Filevine, where you can kind of just plug in random deadlines at a time. And those are reminder schedules. Wanted to jump in there since it does heavily affect deadline chains.
You do have to be subscribed to a project in order to get updates in your feed about those reminders. So definitely make sure you do that. And as Amy mentioned, if you don't go in and change it, it's going to be the org default. If you've never gone in and done a reminder schedule, your org default starts at 180 days before and goes up to 180 days after. That is a lot of reminders about one deadline. So you may want to go in or have your org admin go in and at least create a more manageable reminder schedule for you all to utilize.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jasmine. Yes, that is one of an optimization. That's one of the first things we take a look at when we're doing deadline chains or deadline fields. We start having that conversation about reminder schedules. And these are what the reminders look like. So if you ever are curious, maybe you haven't delved into the reminder world, the reminders look like this. If you have your notifications set up externally to Filevine, you can get emails of reminders. There is a way to set up, even just like a daily digest of your reminders. You can do that if you don't want to receive individual ones. But the daily digest is super helpful. Lets you know, hey, these are all the deadlines you have coming up. And as you saw how to get to it on a project level, you can go to filter and just select reminders, and you'll see all the reminders on this particular project. They do, as Jasmine said, if you're subscribed, it goes to your user feed right here.
And Amy, there's a question. Am I able to access the same if I download the Filevine app?
Oh, that's a good question.
So there's not really a Filevine app. It's still web-based. So you'll use
Yeah.
them like through Safari or something like that, and you can
Mhm.
like make it a thumbnail so you can easily access it. There should
Yes.
be kind of the same layout and notification options in the web browser. It'll obviously just look a little different because it's formatted for a cell phone as opposed to
Mhm.
a like computer web browser. So you may need to navigate like into the three lines in the top left-hand corner to see all of the options that you would have in your blue bar. Once you go into an individual project, your activity feed, again, you may need to go and filter in order to see those. But you should still have the same capabilities there
Yep.
that you do here on your web.
Yes, thank you, Jasmine. And same thing goes for tablet too. If you're accessing it on a tablet, again, same thing, browser based through whatever your browser server is, and then you can still should be able to still do all the same things that you do in regular browser. Right. So once you're creating your deadline, you've got dependent on another deadline, high calendar, your reminder schedule. You select your reminder schedule. You can actually select a different reminder schedule for each deadline in your chain. It doesn't have to be the same on every deadline. So that's helpful, especially if, again, you're doing like a trial order where you've got your trial date, witness list, exhibit list, things like that, you may want to have a different reminder schedule. Again, you can plug in a URL. Maybe you're referencing a local rule. You're referencing something a website they need to visit in order to complete the deadline. And then you can plug in any notes. So the notes actually do pop up on the front end here. So let me add, and I'll show you what that looks like. So we'll just call this a test deadline. We'll make it not dependent, and then we'll type in test note and once you get your deadline done, you click save, and that's an anchor deadline that you have there. So I'll show you what that looks like on the front end before we go in and make a dependent deadline. So you do have to have your deadline chain section visible, which we do have here. And then we can add our chain. Hello. And then you'll see all of your parent or anchor deadlines will automatically pop up. And then you can enter in the completed date. This one will trigger because of the way it is set up. So let's pick a random date here. And then, oh, actually, this one's backwards. Enter it in here and it will trigger other items. And here is our notes on the test deadline. If you just click on the little eye, it'll show you the notes that you enter in on that back end. So if you need to instruct your staff something regarding that deadline, hey, make sure you're entering it in, the complete date, you can put that in right there. Now let's go into creating a dependent deadline. So when you check this little box, we've got a lot more options. This is where it can get kind of confusing if you're not as familiar with deadline chains. You will select what deadline it is that is triggering this particular deadline. So whenever a trial date gets a due date, if it's going like, hey, X amount of days from the trial date, then you're going to want to say when trial date gets due date. However, if this is like a chain for discovery and you're wanting to trigger that discovery deadline for 30 days for discovery, then that would be when service gets completed. So just keep that in mind. Really think about what you're trying to accomplish and trigger, and that will help you guide whether it needs to be completed or due date. And then you select your cadence here, so the amount of days. There is also an option for weeks, months, or years. So if it's something where you're trying to track like, oh, I have to keep this file for X amount of years, you can put that in here if you need to for archive cases. then it's going to say default. So this is what's called a judicial calendar. This will tell you how it's counting the days. So if you have a court that for whatever reason only counts business days, you can build that judicial calendar in this judicial calendar space. Or, just default is going to be count every day, or you have count every day right here. Or default. And then you've got this is another area in deadline chains where you want to pay attention. Is the deadline going to be triggered later or earlier? So for example, our trial date here for this task trial order, we are wondering when our trial date gets a due date. We want this to trigger earlier since that trial date is in the future. So we want this particular deadline to trigger 10 days earlier, and then call it test deadline 2. And then you also have the option to round to next day instead of prior. This is for if anything happens to land on weekends. You also, again, have your reminder schedule here. So if you need to select that reminder schedule for this deadline, again, you can pick it for each deadline. So you've got an option here. So we'll make our reminder schedule. And then again, you can add any notes or URL. And then we click save.
Two things, sorry, Amy.
Yeah, go
The
ahead.
judicial calendar, when you go in to create it, the weekends and the weekends, I always say evenings, and holidays are automatically going to be like grayed out. You do have to reselect any days outside of that for each year. So if, for instance, on this calendar, you don't want to count any of the February or any of the Fridays in February, you can black those out. In 2025, you're going to have to go in and do the same thing. The only thing that
Yeah.
transfers year over year are weekends and holidays. So make sure that you all are checking that. You can, go out as far as you'd like, kind of pre-planning that, but know that it doesn't hold over. And then the due and done or completed dates that you see are similar to your deadline with reminder fields, where the due date is the day that the deadline is, and the done date is when it's been satisfied. Sometimes folks get confused and think completed means, okay, I put a date in here, or a date's been set, or I've looked at this. And so that may help you as you go in to actually create these deadline chains in envisioning what that gets a due date versus gets completed looks like. There is a question. How
Yes.
would you auto trigger a task flow based on project being created?
Absolutely. So for project creation, you would put that task flow, just whatever that task flow is, in your leading phase. So for example, this leading phase for this project is intake. So you would pop into your customs editor, task flow, advanced, and then phases, and then you go to your leading phase, and you could have it trigger when the phase changes, and this particular task will trigger upon creation of the project.
As long as you keep it as create 0 days after phase changes, it'll immediately create. If you change that, it'll obviously be however many
Yeah,
days you sent that out.
absolutely. So if you have like 10 tasks that need to occur at the creation of a project, you can absolutely set up 10 separate tasks when phase changes and put, yeah, create at 0. All right. Okay, back. Okay, now that we've got our deadline, our dependent deadline here, it's created earlier. We can go in and actually go ahead and remove this chain and re-trigger it with our deadline again. And then we'll talk about how another good use here of our chain. And there it goes. And then now we've got our test deadline here that we just created. You can also organize your deadlines here in the back, and if you want it to appear in a certain order, you can use your little arrows and just, organize them around. Maybe in whatever order that you want them completed, or you could do that here by the little arrows. Another good thing to know about deadline chains is you can actually change the name of them for on a project level. You can also trigger the same chain multiple times. I say this because you can, if you're using it for discovery, for example, and there's multiple defendants, or you get served multiple discovery, or you're serving multiple discovery, same thing for service. You can actually rename, let's see here, we'll just use like service. Check our little box here. And then now you've got your name, and then you can come in, trigger that same chain again. And then we can call it and then just click check. And then let's give this one a due date too, because I'm going to show you guys what that looks like on, oh no, on our calendar here. All right, so as we mentioned earlier, those deadlines go on the project calendar. Oops. Oh, okay, there it is. Our project calendar. I have this project calendar set on list view, but obviously you can have your month view here. But I like my list view, and then you'll see in the name of the event that name of the deadline chain. That's why that renaming that deadline chain can be helpful, again, especially if you're triggering it more than one time. If it's related to different defendants for discovery or service, you'll see it here. Now, when you complete a deadline, it does not remove it from the calendar. What it does is it adds, so here we go. There we go. It just adds a completed next to it here. There you go, a done. So it'll stop the reminders of the reminder schedule that we have, and then it'll just apply that done. So you know that deadline did exist, but it was satisfied. So that's what scrape out deadline change is, not removing it from anybody's calendar, so you know that deadline's still there, but the done add lets you know that that deadline has been taken care of, and you'll stop receiving those reminders on those deadlines. The last piece in deadline chains is you can create a deadline group. So this is actually a deadline group right here that's already created that I'll kind of walk through. Deadline groups are where you have a deadline. This one happens to be motion in limine that triggers when that trial gets a due date, and it's set to be due, the group to be due 0 days after that due date. So this is saying that we've got two options essentially for this deadline. So you'll see this motion in limine personal or motion in limine by mail. So only completing of one of these deadlines would complete the whole group. And they can have different days. So you'll see here, this deadline actually completed is going to be 5 days earlier, and this one's actually 10 days earlier. So you can actually set that up. You can have more than two, you can have three, but it's kind of like it's like an or scenario. So you don't need to complete all of them to complete the group. You only need to complete one. So let's look at the front end here. Let's pop into one that's not been triggered. So there we go. We've got our 2 for the group. So as you'll see, if I complete by mail, this one, it completes a group, and the other deadline actually goes away because I've completed the whole group. So I see that in some case management orders where they'll have like, you know, maybe this is the e-service deadline and this is the mail service deadline for a particular like order or a motion. And then you can actually apply that into the group since it's kind of like an or situation to satisfy the whole group of the deadlines.
Just a few more pieces on this kind of deadlines page. If you change the due date or the completed date, it will update all of the future dates for you. So if your trial date is your anchor and that gets pushed, as trials sometimes do, it'll recalculate for you the other dates there. It'll still let you know if it's overdue or how many days you have left. Amy mentioned reorganization in the other page, but you can also filter or sort, I guess, and change how you want to sort there. So if you prefer to see it, you know, chronologically or alphabetically, you can do that there. And then while these dates go onto the project calendar, including the done items, your global calendar is only going to show you dates that have yet to be completed. Those notes will show up across the board that Amy kind of just pointed out. Those will show up in the calendar whenever you go in either the project calendar or your master calendar. But again, that master calendar is only going to show dates that have yet to be completed. Once you put that done date or completed date in, they'll be removed from that global calendar. You'll stop getting those notifications for reminders. So you do want to make sure you come in and complete these.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jasmine. Same thing goes for deadline fields. You do want to make sure they're being completed. It can mess up your reporting. So make starting good habits in Filevine to keep the health of your Filevine and your data is always great. Otherwise, when you do reporting in the future, if you're just not completing deadlines, your users are going to continue to get reminders. We see it a lot in optimization. Especially if firms that have been in Filevine a long time. That's one of the reports I run in audits is to see how many outstanding deadlines there are, and there are thousands, and that will make user feeds unmanageable for your users. So just keep that in mind. And that is deadline chains and task flows.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amy. If you all are not seeing that deadline chains section, they either A, may be hidden, or B, may not just be added into your org. It is a built-in section in Filevine. So all you have to do is ask somebody that has the advanced permissions to get that added. And then you guys can go in and kind of create those items. For task flows, as long as the phases are there, you guys can go in and add. If you want that task flow trigger button, as Amy mentioned, you do have to add that into customs editor before you can actually attach a task to it. But thank you so much, Amy, for all of your knowledge. I always learn something when you do these calls. So thank you so much. Hopefully you all
Thank
learned
you.
something as well. I did put my email and Amy's email in the chat. So if you all did have any questions, want to take advantage of that audit, or just are like, hey, I need some optimization help, feel free to reach out. We'll get you directed to the right folks that can help out with that. We hope to see you all on another free help session. Thanks so much for joining us and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.